You wake up not in a soft bed, but on a damp, prickly bed of straw that smells of earth and mice. There are smoky beams above your head and mold stains on the walls of sticks and clay. The rough door smells cold, and in the center of the room, the last embers of the hearth smolder. There is thick, almost palpable darkness and silence, broken only by your own breathing and the coughing of the household members sleeping nearby. No electricity, no running water, no first aid kit. Only your own hands, tired body, and a world in which man is not the master, but a fragile part of the merciless nature. Dark Ages England, the period after the Romans left and before the Normans came, did not forgive weakness. A simple scratch could lead to death from blood poisoning. A bad harvest meant famine. A Viking raid or a neighboring chieftain's raid left no women, children, or hope. Every night was a test, every morning a victory. War, hunger, cold, and the pervasive fear of the supernatural were not isolated phenomena, but the fabric of everyday life. The question remains open. Could a 21st century man, born in safety and comfort, have survived the harsh, ruthless reality of the Dark Ages? Could you survive? The answer lies in the 10 key trials that separated life from death, and these trials began as soon as you opened your eyes. The first and foremost challenge is hunger. There were no stores or supermarkets in Dark Ages England. To eat, you had to go to the woods, the river, or the coast. This was your only supermarket, and there were no price tags or guarantees. Every tree, every bush, every rock on the shore could be the difference between life and a slow, starving death. Survival depended not on strength, but on a deep, intimate knowledge of one's piece of land. The Anglo-Saxons had an encyclopedic knowledge of botany, which was passed down from generation to generation. The Anglo-Saxons had an encyclopedic knowledge of botany that had been passed down for generations. They gathered young nettles rich in iron and vitamins, wild garlic, sorrel, and the first shoots of ferns for a thick broth, the first green food after winter. In the fall, they gathered hazelnuts, wild apples, blackthorn, and elderberries, some of which they ate immediately, and some of which they dried for the winter. In winter, when the ground was covered with snow, they knew which signs to use to find burdock root or other edible rhizomes underneath. They were mushroom experts, but the price of error was deadly. For those who lived by the sea, the coast was another harvest field. At low tide, women and children wandered over wet rocks to collect edible seaweed, mussels, snails, and other mollusks. They risked their lives to climb the cliffs for seabird eggs, a valuable source of protein. Fish were caught in all possible ways. Netting of nettle fiber, willow rods, spearing, and bone hooks were used. Everything was used. Frogs, snails, freshwater mollusks were not a delicacy, but available protein, which was collected by children. Hunting big game was the privilege of the nobility, but a peasant could set horsehair snares for a hare or trap a bird. Those who served the Lord had better food, barley or oat porridge, sometimes pork from the Lord's herd, but they didn't always have enough. The diet of most was based on a perpetual stew, pottage, boiled in the same pot for weeks. They threw into it whatever they could find: turnips, onions, beans. Sometimes the blood of a slaughtered animal, dried skin, or even powdered bones were added for nourishment. The taste was monotonous, often bland, but hot food was the key to survival. The real luxury, the sweetest of which, was honey. Finding a hollow with wild bees was a great fortune. At the risk of being severely bitten, a man extracted honeycomb, which gave not only sweetness, but also the most valuable product for making mead. During the famine years, people made flour from acorns. They are bitter and poisonous when raw, but the Anglo-Saxons knew to soak them for a long time in running water in a cloth bag to get rid of the tannins. They stored everything in underground pits where it was cool and not so damp. A spoilage of supplies could mean the death of the whole village. Rats were feared as much as wolves. Hunger was a frequent visitor. Chronicles describe times when people ate tree bark, leather belts, boiled shoes. There were also cases of cannibalism, and this is not a legend, but the reality of the desperate recorded in the annals. Could you, a man of the 21st century, survive in a forest full of plants, not knowing which one will kill you and which one will feed you? Would you be able to eat a snail, an earthworm, or dig up a root to live to see tomorrow? Could you endure months of chronic aching hunger that makes your body weak just when you have to work in the fields? Life in the Dark Ages began with the question, what will I eat today? And often there was simply no answer. The second challenge was the invisible enemy that was everywhere. In the water, in your food, on your skin, and in your clothes. It was a world without antibiotics, antiseptics, and basic hygiene. Your body was a battlefield, and you were losing it every day, living in a state of constant physical discomfort that is hard for modern people to even imagine. The concept of germs did not exist. Diseases were attributed to the anger of the gods, evil spirits, bad air, or an imbalance of bodily fluids. Therefore, a simple scratch received in the field could become a death sentence. A simple scratch received in the field could be a death sentence. Without antibiotics, the body could fight it for weeks, but often lost, and the person died in agony from sepsis. Anglo-Saxon medical compendiums, healers, are full of recipes for herbal and honey soaks, which had some antiseptic effect, and magical incantations to expel flying poison or elf shot, so explained for sudden illnesses. But they were powerless against serious infection. Parasites were constant companions. Lice and fleas swarmed in the straw mattresses, in the coarse woolen clothes, in the hair. This meant a constant debilitating itch that drove people crazy. By combing the bites, people would get infection in them, leading to ulcers and skin diseases. It was almost impossible to get rid of the parasites. Inside the body lived other guests, worms and solitaires, which got into the body with poorly treated food or dirty water and slowly exhausted their host. This created a background of constant malaise. There was almost no clean drinking water. Water was taken from rivers and lakes, where sewage, animal, and human waste went. It was a broth of bacteria that caused dysentery, typhoid, and cholera. Constant diarrhea was the norm of life. It dehydrated and weakened the body, making it vulnerable to other diseases. Toothache was a real torture. There was little sugar in the diet, so tooth decay was less common than it is today. But their food, especially bread made of coarse flour, contained a lot of sand and small stones from the millstones. This eroded the enamel, leading to tooth wear, gum inflammation, and abscesses. There was no cure. The only solution was to pull out the diseased tooth, which was done by the village blacksmith or witch doctor without any anesthesia, often breaking the jaw in the process. Plague, smallpox, tuberculosis, leprosy. These diseases came in waves, wiping out entire villages. Medieval chronicles describe families dying in their homes because no one dared go near them for fear of contagion. The only hope was the herbalists and witch doctors, whose knowledge of the medicinal properties of plants was vast but powerless against serious infections. Decoctions of willow bark, a natural aspirin, could bring down a fever. Plantain could stop blood, but that was all. Childbirth was a deadly enterprise, and postpartum maternity fever, sepsis, claimed the lives of many young women. Could you stand the constant itching all over your body? An excruciating toothache from which there is no escape but a crippling operation? Could you drink water knowing it could kill you? Could you watch your child die of fever, and the only thing you can do is read incantations and put herbs on his forehead? Modern life has accustomed us to the immediate relief of any discomfort. Would your mind be able to withstand a reality where a slight ailment is a luxury and the background state of the body is pain and irritation? The third challenge was a constant, pervasive fear. The world outside the palisades of your village was hostile. The danger came not only from disease and hunger, but also from very real enemies with swords and axes. Survival required not only physical strength, but also a special psychology. The psychology of a man in a perpetual siege, where home is a fortress and any stranger is a potential threat. The forests of England at that time were wild and dangerous. They were teeming with wolves and wild boars. A lone traveler or a calf that had strayed from the herd could easily fall prey to them. At night, the howls from the woods were a chilling reminder that man was not the king of nature, but only one of the species struggling for existence. But the beasts were not the worst threat. After the Romans left, Britain was plunged into the chaos of wars between small Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. A neighboring chieftain, Tan, could at any time decide to expand his holdings at the expense of your village. This meant war, looting, violence, burned houses. Every free man was obliged to be a member of the militia, the Fyrd. At the signal of the alarm, he had to throw down his plow, take up his spear and shield, and go to battle. This was not a professional army, but you and your neighbors, and the chances of dying in a skirmish were high. And from the end of the 8th century came a new, even more terrible threat from the sea: the Vikings. Their long drukars could sail up the rivers inland, appearing suddenly and sowing terror. Their aim was not land but booty, grain, livestock, church treasures, and most importantly, people. Men were killed and women and children were taken away as slaves to be sold in markets from Dublin to Constantinople. The attack was swift and brutal. Monasteries such as Lindisfarne were plundered first, but the Vikings soon realized that ordinary villages could also be plundered. To counter them, kings such as Alfred the Great created a system of fortified fortress cities, burgs, where the population of the surrounding villages could flee in the event of a raid. But getting there in time was a separate challenge. Life passed in a state of constant psychological siege. Every night the doors had to be locked and sentries posted. Any stranger appearing on the road aroused suspicion. A noise on the river could mean the approach of a drakkar. This life of constant tension was as exhausting as physical labor. There were no police, no emergency services, no army to come to the rescue. Your safety was in your hands, the hands of your neighbors, and the strength of your palisade. After the raid, you were left with burned houses, murdered relatives, and the trauma of having to move on, trying to rebuild from scratch, knowing that they might come back. Could you live knowing that any night could be your last? Could you fall asleep to the howling of wolves or waiting for the Viking battle horn? Modern man suffers from anxiety caused by news and social media, but our fear is virtual. Their fear was real. It smelled of smoke and blood, and it was right outside the door. The ability to live with that fear, to not go crazy, to keep working and raising children, was a special survival skill that we have lost. Would you personally have been able to take up arms to defend your family, knowing that you were a simple farmer, not a warrior? The fourth challenge is the cold. Not the cold from which we escape by turning on the heating, but the total, bone-penetrating cold from which there was almost no escape from fall to spring. It was not just weather, but a permanent physical condition that shaped everyday life, habits, and even character. Clothing and housing were not a matter of comfort, but a line of defense in the daily battle for survival. Your clothing was your only armor, and its scientific principles had been honed over centuries. It consisted of several layers. On your body, a coarse linen shirt, if you were lucky, that absorbed sweat. On top of that, 1 or 2 tunics of undyed, spiky, greasy-to-the-touch wool. Wool was an ingenious material. Its fibers have a hollow structure that perfectly traps air, creating an insulating layer. What's more, it keeps you warm even when wet, drawing moisture away from your body. On top was a heavy hooded woolen cloak, often soaked in grease, lanolin, which was a natural water repellent. There were no buttons. Everything was fastened with ties or rough bone fibulae. Clothes were not washed for months so as not to wash off that protective grease. It smelled of sweat, smoke, the cattle yard, and damp. It was the smell of life. Your shoes were probably just pieces of leather wrapped around your foot and secured with straps. In wet weather, feet would get wet instantly. To avoid frostbite, dry moss or straw was stuffed inside, creating an extra layer of insulation that had to be replaced every day. We slept without undressing, often in our shoes because it was torture to put on icy, wet clothes in the morning. The feeling of constant dampness in the feet was the norm. Your house is a hut made of interwoven rods covered with clay and dung. Such a wall breathes, but it also blows through. The only source of heat was an open hearth in the center of the room, without a chimney. Smoke ate your eyes and filled your lungs with soot, but it also served an essential function. Smoke soaking into the thatched roof made it less attractive to insects and rodents and preserved the wood slightly. The floor was compacted earth covered with a thick layer of straw, which absorbed dirt and moisture and was infested with fleas. There were no windows. The openings were closed for the winter with rags, wooden shutters, or oiled ox blood that let in the murky light. At night, the whole family, often together with the most valuable animals, goat, sheep, calf, huddled together on a common straw mattress, covering themselves with skins and rags. Their body heat was the main source of heating. A cow gives off about as much heat as a small heater, and in a confined space, this was of great importance. It was an ingenious survival strategy, but it meant a complete lack of privacy and hygiene. You woke up to a goat sniffing your face, and that was the norm. The social hierarchy was evident even here. The best, warmest places by the fire went to the head of the family, and the rest of us were further away, in the cold and dark. Could you wear the same scratchy, smelly, heavy clothes for months on end? Could you fall asleep feeling fleas crawling all over you? Would you be able to function when your body's almost never completely dry and warm? We are used to thermoregulation, to showers, to clean clothes. These are basic needs for us. It was an unattainable luxury for them. Their bodies were hardened to the extreme, while ours were pampered. To survive the winter in such conditions was a feat of will and physiology, which they accomplished every year. The fifth challenge is physical exhaustion. We have already talked about the physical fitness of the peasant, but it is important to understand the psychological side of this labor. It was not a voluntary exercise for health or beauty, but a lifelong servitude with no right of appeal. Not working meant a quick and painful starvation death for the whole family. Your body was not your personal project, but a working tool belonging to the cycle of survival. The day began before dawn. One had to fetch water from a well or a river, often hundreds of meters away. The buckets were wooden and heavy, 15-20 liters each. It was a daily farmer's walk with a huge weight. Firewood had to be chopped. The axe was rough and heavy, and the wood was hard. Then the work in the field began. Plowing the land with a primitive plow pulled by oxen, if there were any, or by the people themselves, was a hellish labor. The plow had to be constantly held and pushed while walking on the viscous, rocky soil. By evening, my back and arms were falling off. Haymaking was a real race for survival. You had to cut the grass before the rains came. Scythe work was rhythmic, powerful movements with the whole body, which lasted for 12-14 hours under the scorching sun. The harvest was no less hard. Bent over, they cut the ears with sickles, tied them into sheaves, and carried them to the barn. Even domestic work was grueling. Women spent hours grinding grain into flour on handheld stone millstones. Monotonous, heavy work that required tremendous arm and back strength and caused characteristic joint deformities. They carried water, kneaded dough in huge tubs, and wove on cumbersome, vertical looms where weights stretched the warped threads. This labor had no days off in our understanding, except for religious holidays. The animals had to be fed and watered every day. Fire had to be kept burning every day. Food had to be prepared every day. There was no concept of sick leave or time off. If you were sick but could stand on your feet, you went to work. If you couldn't, your work fell on the shoulders of the elderly and children. Chronic pain was the norm. Skeletons from that time show signs of severe arthritis, compression fractures of the spine, worn joints. People live with pain we have no idea about, without access to painkillers. Would you be able to keep up that kind of regimen? Not a week, not a month, but a lifetime. No vacation of your choice, no possibility of changing jobs, no hope of retirement, because old age meant only that you would work until you fell down. Our bodies were not used to such a strain, but our minds were even more unaccustomed. We worked for a paycheck, a career, self-fulfillment. They worked for the sole purpose of making it to the next morning. Would you be able to find the strength to get up every day, knowing that another day of pain, sweat, and fatigue awaits you until you die? The sixth challenge is sensory deprivation. We live in a world oversaturated with light and information. Our nights are brighter than their days. We have access to all kinds of knowledge instantly. Their world was dark, quiet, and incredibly localized. Surviving in it meant surviving inside your own head with little to no external stimuli. As the sun went down, life practically stopped. The only source of light in the hut was the hearth, which gave off a dim, uneven light that picked out faces and objects from the gloom, creating bizarre shadows. Chip or tallow lamps were luxuries and smoked, and were saved for special occasions. This meant that the long winter evenings, which could last 14 to 16 hours, were spent in almost total darkness. This darkness was not just the absence of light, it was tangible. It was pressurizing. It harbored fears, both real and imagined. The silence was just as absolute. There was no noise of cars, no hum of electrical appliances, no background music. There were only the sounds of nature, the howl of the wind, the cry of an owl, the crackle of a cricket, and the sounds of the house, snoring, coughing, the quiet mooing of a cow behind the partition. This silence sharpened my hearing and imagination to the utmost. Every incomprehensible sound in the night could mean danger, a crouching beast, a thief, or, which in their minds was no less real, an evil spirit. In this silence and darkness, the inner world, the world of dreams, fears, memories, became much more vivid and meaningful than the outer world. The information vacuum was complete. There were no newspapers, no radio, no internet. News spread slowly, with roving traders, monks, or soldiers, and often reached in a distorted form months after the events. The peasant's world was limited to his village and maybe a neighboring market. He did not know who ruled in Constantinople, nor did he know about scientific discoveries. His universe was small, insular, and often hostile. This isolation had its advantages: the absence of global stresses, but it also created ignorance and fear of everything alien and incomprehensible. Any foreigner speaking another language was considered a sorcerer or spy. Any natural phenomenon, such as a comet or an eclipse, was considered a bad omen, portending pestilence or war. Would you be able to spend 14 hours of a winter night in a dark, quiet room without a smartphone, without a book, without a TV series? Could you live without knowing what's going on in the world outside your valley? Our psyche, accustomed to constant stimulation, may simply not be able to tolerate such a sensory diet and lack of novelty. For us, darkness and silence are a deficit, a state to be avoided. For them, it was a norm of life that needed to be filled with something from within. Stories, songs, prayers, a craft that could be done by touch. Would you be able to confront the monsters your own bored mind generates in absolute silence and darkness? The seventh challenge is social disenfranchisement. We take for granted concepts such as freedom of speech, personal integrity, equality before the law, and social mobility. For the Anglo-Saxon peasant, these concepts did not exist. His life was woven into a rigid hierarchical system where he was at the bottom and his personal will meant little or nothing. Society was clearly divided into several classes. At the top was the king, and below him were his thenas, or chiefs, and the military aristocracy. The basis of society was the free peasants, the ceorls, but even their freedom was relative. Below them were various categories of semi-free people, and at the very bottom were the slaves, the teovas, who made up a large part of the population and were considered mere property, like cattle. You could not change your position. If you were born a slave or a ceorl, you died a slave. Your life did not belong to you, but to your Lord Tan. You lived on his land. You could not leave it without his permission. You had to give him part of your harvest, rent, and work his fields a few days a week with your oxen and your plow. He was your judge. If you had a dispute with a neighbor, you went to the tenant's court, which was held in his large hall. If you committed a crime, he determined your punishment. You had no right to property as we understand it. Your house, your livestock, your crops, all these things ultimately belonged to the Lord. The relationship between the Lord and his men was based on the principle of loyalty. The Lord was the ring giver who was supposed to protect his men and reward them for their service. The people in turn swore an oath of loyalty to him. To break this oath was a terrible crime, but the system was highly asymmetrical. A lord could take your best cow or your daughter into his service, and you could not object. Violence was the norm and the privilege of the strong. Tan could beat you or punish you for the slightest offense. His word was law. Of course, there were some ancient customs that somewhat limited the arbitrariness, but in general, your life was at the complete mercy of the other man. If a 10 decided to go to war against a neighbor, you had to take your spear and go to fight and die for him. Your life was a bargaining chip in his games for power and glory. The psychology of survival in such a system required not pride or self-esteem, but deep-rooted humility and the ability to be invisible. One had to learn to read the master's mood, to anticipate his desires, not to provoke his anger. It was a daily psychological labor. Could you live in a world where you have no voice? Where your fate and the fate of your family depends on the mood of one person? Where justice is not the law but the will of the strong? We who grew up in a culture of individualism and human rights would probably rebel. But rebellion in those days meant a quick and painful death. Survival required not pride but pragmatism. It required learning to be invisible, not to provoke the anger of the master, to accept one's share as a given, prescribed by God and fate. It was a psychological skill that is hard for us to even imagine. The eighth challenge is to live in an enchanted, animated world. For us, the world obeys the laws of physics. It is material and mostly predictable. For the man of the Dark Ages, the world was permeated with supernatural forces, and the line between reality and myth was completely blurred. Survival in such a world required not only physical skills, but also the ability to navigate a complex web of omens, rituals, and prohibitions. Every forest, every swamp, every ancient mound was inhabited by spirits, elves, goblins, dwarves. Some were harmless, but others were hostile and could do harm. The sudden sharp pain in his side could have been mistaken for an elf shot. Before cutting down a tree, one had to apologize to it. When entering the forest, one had to be careful not to disturb its masters. A child's illness could be caused not by an infection, but by an evil spirit looking at him. Superstitions governed every step. The sprinkling of salt, the cawing of a crow in a certain place, meeting a hare on the road. All these were omens that had to be interpreted correctly. There were conspiracies and rituals for all occasions. For the cow to give more milk, to protect the house from lightning, to bewitch the beloved. They wore amulets, drilled stones, boar's fangs, pieces of amber. Words had magical power. A curse spoken aloud was considered a real threat. Dreams were not subconscious games, but direct messages from the other world. They could be visions from God, warnings from dead ancestors, or temptations from the devil. Each dream was carefully analyzed. The church fought pagan beliefs, but often only put a Christian gloss on them. Ancient sacred springs were renamed in honor of saints. Pagan holidays were transformed into Christian ones. In the minds of ordinary people, belief in Christ and the saints coexisted peacefully with the belief in housekeepers and leshy. This created a constant mental tension. Any misfortune, from the death of cattle to sudden illness, was perceived not as an accident, but as the result of someone's evil will. The curse of a neighbor witch doctor, the anger of a stream spirit, or punishment from God for a secret sin. Man lived in a constant search for hidden meanings, trying to guess the will of invisible forces and to placate them. The Anglo-Saxon concept of word, an all-powerful, inexorable fate, to which both men and gods were subject. One could try to influence minor events, but one could not escape one's ultimate fate. Could you live in a world where there could be a demon lurking around every corner? Where your future depends on the flight of birds? Where you can't even trust your own dreams? Our rational minds rebel against it. But if you did not accept these rules of the game, you would be considered either a madman or, even worse, a sorcerer, and your life would be in even greater danger. You had to learn to live in two worlds at the same time, the visible world of fields and forests, and the invisible world of spirits, signs, and destinies. The ninth challenge is the justice system, which will strike us as savage and barbaric. In the absence of centralized authority and police, justice was a personal, communal, and often bloody affair. Survival in a dispute depended not on the law, but on the strength of your clan, your reputation, and your faith in divine intervention. The main principle of justice was blood revenge. If a member of your family was murdered, your clan, Mekth, was obliged to avenge it by killing the murderer or someone in his family. The honor of the family demanded vengeance. This led to endless internecine wars that could last for generations, weakening and destroying entire families. Your personal quarrel could easily turn into a clan war. To stop this cycle of violence, there was a system of vergeld, the price of blood. There was a price for killing or maiming each person, depending on their social status. King Alfred's laws, for example, spelled out the exact amounts for everything. For the life of a thane, panon to 200 shillings. For the life of a curl, 200 shillings. There was a price for a black eye, a severed hand, a broken finger. If the murderer or his family could pay the vergel to the victim's family, the vengeance stopped. It was not a matter of justice as we understand it, but a matter of economic transaction, a way of restoring social balance. If a person's guilt was not obvious, the help of the community and God was invoked. The accused could bring sworn assistance, respected people who swore on holy relics that he was innocent. The weight of such an oath depended on the status and number of assistants. If this was not enough, they resorted to the judgment of God, or Dahlia. The accused had to prove his innocence by passing a test. For example, to take a red-hot piece of iron in his hands and carry it a few steps. Then the hand was bandaged, and after 3 days, the bandage was removed. The priest examined the wound. If it healed cleanly, God showed that the man was innocent. If the wound was festering, he was guilty. Another test was the cold water test. The accused was tied up and thrown into the river, which was considered sacred. If he sank, the water accepted him as innocent. If he floated, the water as a pure element did not accept the sinner, and he was guilty. Would you be able to live in a system where killing your brother can simply be bought for a few cows? Where your innocence depends on how quickly the burn on your arm heals? We rely on evidence, witnesses, lawyers. They relied on the power of family, money, and what they believed to be the will of God. Surviving in such a system meant being willing to either kill back, have a family wealthy enough to pay off, or have incredible faith or luck to pass the hurdles. The final and perhaps most difficult challenge is the constant, everyday presence of death. In our world, death is a sterile, medicalized event removed from the brackets of everyday life and taking place in hospitals and hospices. In the Dark Ages, death was domestic, intimate, and omnipresent. It was not a tragic exception, but an expected part of the cycle of life, and survival required the ability to face it without breaking down. Child mortality was appalling. It is estimated that 30% to 50% of children did not live to the age of 5. They died from childhood diseases, which today we treat with a single vaccination, from dehydration due to diarrhea, from malnutrition during the hungry winter. Families were large, but this was not so much a joy as a severe biological necessity. Many children had to be born in the hope that at least a few of them would survive, work in the fields, and become helpers in old age. Parents loved their children, but their love was colored by fatalism. Death in childbirth was common for women. Lack of hygiene and knowledge of antisepsis turned every birth into Russian roulette. Maternal fever, postpartum sepsis, was one of the leading causes of death for young women. Any infection, any simple trauma like an open fracture, any hunger year claimed lives. The average life expectancy was around 30-35 years. This does not mean that everyone died young. If a person was lucky enough to survive a dangerous childhood and adolescence, he or she could live to be 50 or 60 years old, but very many did not. This meant that life was a series of losses. A man was almost guaranteed to bury many of his children, siblings, friends, perhaps his first wife in his lifetime. Grief was a constant backdrop to life, but there was no time for long worry and depression. After the funeral, one had to get back to work. Otherwise, the survivors could starve to death as well. Death was also an economic disaster. The death of a man meant the loss of the main labor force. A family could lose its landholding if it could not pay the lord's jeria, inheritance tax. The death of a woman meant the collapse of the household. The dying and funeral process itself was completely different. Death took place at home, surrounded by family. The living cared for the dying person, heard his last breath, closed his eyes. There were no funeral homes. The family washed the body themselves, wrapped it in a simple linen shroud, and buried it. In the early Anglo-Saxon period, pagan traditions were strong. People were buried with funeral equipment, weapons, tools, jewelry that might be needed in the afterlife. With the advent of Christianity, the practice changed. Now people were buried on consecrated church land, and the main help to the deceased was not things, but the prayers of the living for his soul. It required incredible emotional fortitude, almost stoicism. People were more fatalistic. Death was seen as an inevitable part of life, as God's will. But that doesn't mean they didn't feel pain. They felt it, but they didn't have the luxury of succumbing to it for long. Their culture gave them the tools to experience grief, communal rituals, lamentation, memorial feasts, and, most importantly, a strong belief in an afterlife and future resurrection. If you grew up in a culture where death was hidden and considered abnormal, could you handle it? Would you be able to personally wash the body of a dead parent? Would you be able to bury your child and then go to the field the next day because otherwise your other children would die? Could you live knowing that your loved ones could die at any moment from causes that today seem trivial to us? This ability to accept loss without falling apart, to continue to live and work in the face of constant grief, is perhaps the most important survival skill we have irrevocably lost. Life during the Dark Ages in England is not just a story of the past, it is a story of the incredible resilience and endurance of those who were able to survive the harshest conditions imaginable. Every day was a struggle against cold, hunger, disease, and constant threat from the outside world. Reflecting on this, it is hard not to wonder, could modern man have gone through all these trials, preserving not only his body, but also his spirit? The answer is probably no. Our bodies are pampered with comfort, our minds are not adapted to this level of violence and uncertainty, our skills have atrophied for lack of use, and our psyches could not withstand this level of loss and fear. Survival in those times required not only physical strength, but also a completely different outlook, a different set of instincts, and a different emotional hardening. If you are fascinated by this type of time travel and want to learn more about the lives, struggles, and mysteries of the past, subscribe to our channel. Together, we will open the doors to forgotten eras and feel the breath of history. Don't miss new videos. There are many more amazing stories to come.